A tsunami wave lifted an entire passenger train and hurled it 200 meters inland while hundreds of villagers who'd climbed aboard for safety drowned inside the carriages they trusted to protect them. The gas explosion equal to 10,000 tons of dynamite vaporized two trains in a single flash that flattened forests for miles. These are the deadliest locomotive derailments where thousands of lives ended in moments of absolute terror. The Queen of the Sea passenger train left Colombo Station on the morning of December 26, 2004, carrying families heading south for the holidays. The 8-car train was packed far beyond its normal capacity, with an estimated 1,700 passengers crammed into every available space. Nobody on board knew that a massive earthquake had struck the ocean floor off the coast of Indonesia just hours earlier, sending walls of water racing toward coastlines across the Indian Ocean. Sri Lanka had no tsunami warning system in place, and station masters along the coastal route received only confused reports about unusual sea behavior that never reached the train crew. The driver continued along the scenic coastal track at normal speed, stopping at small stations to pick up even more passengers who wanted to visit family for the holidays. The first wave struck near Paralilla village around 9:30 in the morning, flooding the tracks and forcing the train to stop. Local villagers saw the stationary train and ran toward it, believing the heavy steel carriages would provide shelter from the rising water. Hundreds of people climbed onto the roof and squeezed between the cars, thinking they'd found safety in the massive weight of the locomotive and its carriages. The second wave rose to heights of 9 or 10 meters and lifted the locomotive completely off the rails, hurling it and the front carriages inland with tremendous force. The massive steel train that people had trusted to protect them became a weapon that crushed and drowned everyone in its path as carriages tumbled and telescoped into each other while the water tore through them. More than 1,700 people died in the Queen of the Sea disaster, making it the deadliest rail accident in recorded history. Bodies were scattered across hundreds of meters, with many swept out to sea when the water receded. A memorial now stands at Paralilla, featuring the wrecked carriages positioned upright as a permanent reminder of that terrible morning, and the disaster prompted the creation of the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System in 2006. But natural disasters were not the only force capable of destroying trains filled with passengers. The passenger train traveling between Mansi and Saharsa carried 1,000 people through the monsoon-soaked countryside of northeastern India, including 4 wedding parties dressed in their finest clothes, heading to celebrations that would never happen. The 9-car train was overloaded far beyond safe limits because ticket enforcement barely existed in rural areas where demand always exceeded supply. A powerful cyclone had been battering the region for days. The Bagmati River had risen far above its normal banks, and the water was moving fast enough to carry away anything that fell into it. What happened when the train approached the bridge crossing this swollen river remains disputed because documentation's poor, with some reports blaming the cyclone for weakening the bridge structure, while others claim the engineer braked suddenly to avoid hitting a cow on the tracks. 7 of the 9 carriages left the tracks and plunged into the flooded river below, and the passengers had no chance against the powerful current that swept bodies downstream faster than anyone could respond. The remote location meant that rescue crews took hours to arrive, and by then the river had carried most victims far from the crash site, while divers searched for days in muddy water that made recovery nearly impossible. Official reports listed only 235 deaths, because this number reflected only the bodies actually recovered. But estimates from survivors and local officials suggested the true toll was somewhere between 500 and 800 people. The Bihar disaster remains India's worst rail accident and highlighted the deadly combination of overcrowding, monsoon weather, and inadequate infrastructure that continues to challenge the country's railway system. Wartime conditions created even more dangerous circumstances for rail passengers across Europe. World War I had turned Romania into a battlefield by January 1917, with German forces advancing through the country and thousands of refugees fleeing toward the eastern city of Iași. The train that would become known as the Courier departed from Galati hours late because its original locomotive had been damaged in a bombing raid. By the time the 26-car train began its journey, it carried around 1,000 desperate passengers, including Romanian civilians, Russian soldiers, and French military personnel. People who couldn't fit inside climbed onto the roofs and undercarriages, clinging to any surface that would hold them, and the train was so overloaded that the brake systems were compromised by the sheer weight pressing down on every car. The route to Yash included a steep 10-mile descent toward Chorilla station, and as the train began rolling downhill, the brakes failed completely because soldiers had tampered with the air brake lines and the overcrowding had damaged what remained on the system. The train accelerated to nearly 100 kilometers per hour before reaching a sharp curve near Chorilla station, where the locomotive and cars left the track at tremendous speed and slammed into a stationary locomotive waiting on an adjacent track. The collision ruptured fuel tankers near the station, and fire erupted through the wreckage while passengers who survived the initial crash found themselves trapped in burning wooden carriages with no way to escape. Estimates of the death toll range from 600 to 1,000 people, and the wartime chaos made rescue efforts painfully slow, with bodies recovered over the following days. The Chorilla disaster led to improvements in Romanian rail brake systems, though the war continued to create dangerous conditions for anyone traveling by train. The same year brought another catastrophic brake failure on a different front of the same war. French soldiers were exhausted after months of fighting on the Italian front during one of the bloodiest years of World War I, and the military command decided to grant Christmas leave to boost morale among troops that endured terrible losses. A special train was arranged to carry over 1,000 soldiers from Modane to the steep Marian Valley, consisting of 19 wooden carriages, pulled by a single locomotive through terrain featuring a gradient of more than 3%. The engineer warned his superiors that the brakes were insufficient for such a heavy load on such a steep grade. The military officers ignored his concerns and ordered the train to proceed anyway. The departure from Modane station came at 11:15 in the evening on December 12th, and almost immediately the train began picking up speed faster than the brakes could control until the locomotive was hurtling down the mountain at over 130 kilometers per hour, with the engineer powerless to slow the massive weight pushing him from behind. The train left the tracks on a curve near Saint-Michel-de-Morin, and the wooden carriages telescoped into each other while crushing soldiers who'd been sleeping in their seats. The brakes had overheated so severely during the failed attempt to slow the train that they ignited the wooden cars, and candles that soldiers had been using for light added fuel to the growing inferno, while hundreds of men who survived the initial crash burned to death in carriages they couldn't escape. The official death toll was 435, but many historians believe the actual number exceeded 700, and the remote alpine location made rescue extremely difficult. The Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne disaster remains Europe's worst rail accident and led to stricter regulations about train composition and braking requirements on steep mountain routes throughout the continent. Revolutionary warfare created similar dangers on the other side of the world. The Mexican Revolution had torn the country apart for 5 years by early 1915, and when Venustiano Carranza's forces captured the important city of Guadalajara on January 18th, he wanted to celebrate the victory by reuniting his soldiers with their families. He ordered a special 20-car train to transport the wives, children, and relatives of his troops from Colima, and the train that departed on January 22nd was grotesquely overloaded with approximately 900 passengers clinging to roofs, undercarriages, and any exterior surface that offered a handhold. The route through Jalisco state included a treacherous descent between Ciudad Guzman and Sayula, where the tracks dropped steeply through mountainous terrain, and the brakes that might have controlled a properly loaded train had no chance against the tremendous weight. Passengers were thrown from the roofs as the trains whipped around tight curves at increasing speed, and car after car left the rails until the entire train plunged into a deep canyon with wreckage scattering across the ravine floor. Fewer than 300 people survived the Guadalajara train disaster, making it one of North America's deadliest rail accidents. Among the rescuers were Yaqui Indian allies of Carranza, some of whom took their own lives upon discovering that their families had perished in the wreck, and the disaster exposed the terrible risk of wartime trail transport under chaotic conditions. Decades later, infrastructure failures would create disasters on an even more terrifying scale. 2 passenger trains were passing each other near the small town of Ulutelyak in the early morning hours of June 4, 1989, carrying approximately 1,300 passengers, including many families, with children traveling to Black Sea vacation destinations. Neither train crew knew they were rolling through a massive cloud of invisible gas leaking from a damaged pipeline that had been cracked during construction in 1985. The gas was heavier than air, so instead of dispersing, it collected in the low-lying valley where the railway tracks ran, and pipeline operators who noticed pressure drops assumed the sensors were malfunctioning and increased the gas pressure to compensate rather than investigating the problem. At 1:15 in the morning, the two trains passed each other within the gas cloud, and sparks from the wheels or electrical systems triggered an explosion that investigators later estimated at 10 to 12 kilotons of TNT. The blast was equivalent to a small nuclear weapon and incinerated both trains instantly while flattening trees across 250 hectares and shattering windows in buildings 10 kilometers away. 575 people died, most of them vaporized or burned beyond recognition, and over 800 others suffered severe burns that required treatment from specialists who flew in from around the world, including American doctors invited as part of the new glasnost openness between the superpowers. The Ufa disaster exposed the catastrophic neglect that characterized Soviet infrastructure in its final years and prompted major reforms in pipeline safety monitoring throughout Russia after criminal convictions for officials who'd ignored the warning signs. Human error and negligence continued to cause disasters even in countries with established safety protocols. Ethiopia was suffering through one of the worst famines in modern history when an express train departed Dire Dawa for Addis Ababa on January 13, 1985, carrying approximately 1,000 passengers along the vital Ethio-Djibouti Railway because so many services were running during the crisis. The route included a curved bridge over a deep ravine near the Awash River where the speed limit was clearly marked, and every engineer who worked this route knew that slowing down was essential for safely navigating the curve. The train that day was running with a different locomotive than usual, one that was faster than the regular equipment. The engineer failed to reduce speed as the train approached the curved bridge. Whether this was negligence, distraction, or unfamiliarity with the faster locomotive was never fully determined, but the train entered the curve at excessive speed, and 4 or more carriages tumbled off the bridge and plunged 40 feet into the ravine below. At least 428 people died in the Awash disaster, with over 550 others injured. And the remote location meant that the news of the accident took hours to reach the capital, while rescue operations were slow to begin. The engineer was arrested for negligence, and the disaster remains Africa's worst rail accident, while highlighting the deadly consequences of human error combined with inadequate safety systems. American railroads faced their own deadly encounters with natural forces. Missouri Pacific Railroad's number 11 passenger train departed Denver on the afternoon of August 7, 1904. Carrying approximately 125 passengers bound for St. Louis through the Front Range foothills where summer thunderstorms were building over the mountains. Heavy rain was falling upstream in the normally dry arroyos that crossed the railroad right-of-way, and the train approached Bridge 110B over Dry Creek near the small station of Eden. The engineer noticed rising water levels and slowed the train to 10 or 15 miles per hour as a precaution, deciding to proceed across the 105-foot wooden trestle rather than waiting for conditions that might only get worse. As the locomotive crossed the span, a massive flash flood wave estimated at 20 feet high struck without warning and collapsed the structure instantly, plunging the engine, tender, mail car, baggage car, smoker, and chair car into the raging torrent below. The locomotive submerged near the bridge foundation while other cars were swept downstream and scattered for more than a mile. With the chair car eventually found buried in the sand at the confluence with Fountain Creek, at least 111 passengers died, most of them drowning or crushed inside the tumbling carriages, and bodies were recovered downstream over the following weeks, with some never identified. The Eden train wreck led to improved bridge construction standards and better protocols for operating trains during severe weather across American railroads. Modern technology was supposed to prevent such disasters, but new systems brought new risks. Germany's intercity express train represented the best of modern rail technology when they entered service in 1991, connecting major cities at speeds up to 200 kilometers per hour and symbolizing German engineering excellence in the post-reunification era. On June 3, 1998, ICE Train 884 departed Munich for Hamburg, carrying 287 passengers on what should have been a routine journey before a small metal component failed, with catastrophic consequences near the town of Eschede. A fatigue crack in the steel tires surrounding one of the wheels had been growing undetected, and at 10:57 in the morning, the tires separated completely from the wheel, while the train was traveling at full speed. The loose piece of metal punctured the floor of the passenger car and then jammed into a track switch, redirecting the third car onto a different track, while the rest of the train continued forward until the derailed car struck the support pillars of an overpass bridge and brought the concrete structure down onto the 8 cars that followed. 101 people died in the Eschede disaster, making it Germany's worst rail accident since World War II, and 88 others suffered severe injuries that were often life-changing. Investigations revealed that the monoblock wheel design had not been tested adequately for the stresses of high-speed operation, and the disaster led to complete redesigns of high-speed train wheels along with enhanced maintenance protocols that were adopted by railways around the world. Urban rail systems proved equally vulnerable to human error under pressure. The Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company was facing a crisis on November 1, 1918, as experienced motormen walked off the job in a strike over wages and union recognition while World War I labor shortages and the influenza pandemic created desperate conditions throughout the city. Edward Luciano was a 23-year-old dispatcher who'd received only about 2 hours of training as a motorman before being assigned to drive a 5-car wooden elevated train on the Brighton Beach line during the evening rush with approximately 650 passengers heading home from work. The Brighton Beach line included a sharp S-curve where it entered the Malbone Street Tunnel near Prospect Park, and the speed limit for this dangerous curve was just 6 miles per hour because the tunnel walls were only inches away from passing trains. Luciano entered the curve at somewhere between 30 and 44 miles per hour, and the first car was derailed immediately while the second and third cars slammed into the tunnel walls with tremendous force that disintegrated the wooden construction and sent splinters through the crowded interiors as gas lamps ignited fires in the wreckage. At least 93 people died in the Malbone Street wreck, with some estimates reaching over 100, and more than 250 others were injured. The disaster remains the deadliest accident in New York City subway history and led to massive changes, including steel cars replacing wooden ones, automatic signaling systems being installed, and dramatically increased training requirements for operators. The street itself was renamed Empire Boulevard because residents couldn't bear to see the name Malbone on their addresses. Natural disasters could strike rail lines in ways that nobody anticipated. A massive blizzard had been pounding the Cascade Mountains for more than a week when 2 Great Northern Railway trains became trapped near the small depot of Wellington in late February 1910. With avalanches blocking the tracks in both directions and stranding over 100 passengers and crew members in one of the most remote locations on the entire railway network. The snow kept falling at rates that overwhelmed every effort to clear the tracks, while rotary plows that would normally cut through almost anything kept breaking down or running out of fuel. The stranded passengers watched helplessly as the snow accumulated to depths of 17 to 20 feet around their trapped trains, and some hiked out through the blizzard to reach safety, while most stayed believing that rescue would come eventually. On the night of February 28th, the temperature rose suddenly, snow turned to rain, and thunder rumbled through the mountains in a rare wind and electrical storm that struck the slopes of Windy Mountain above the stranded trains at approximately 1:20 in the morning on March 1st. The lightning triggered an avalanche that was half a mile wide and 14 feet deep, and the wall of snow, rock, and debris slammed into the trains and depot before sweeping everything 150 feet down into the Tye River Valley under 40 feet of debris. 96 people died in the Wellington disaster, making it the deadliest avalanche in American history, and rescue operations continued for weeks with the final bodies not recovered until July when the snow finally melted. The disaster prompted Great Northern to construct a new 8-mile tunnel that bypassed the avalanche-prone section entirely. The town of Wellington was renamed Tye to distance itself from the tragedy. These disasters killed thousands of people and changed how the world thinks about rail safety forever. Tsunami warnings, brake regulations, wheel inspections, and avalanche controls all trace their origins to the terrible lessons learned from these wrecks. The dead can't be brought back, but their stories remind us why safety matters. Hit like and subscribe for more railroad history.